Over the weekend, Russia's Ministry of Foreign Affairs tweeted out a 2014 article that political science professor at the University of Chicago and well-regarded foreign policy thinker John Mearsheimer penned for the Council of Foreign Relations. The piece in question was titled, quote, "Why the Ukraine Crisis is the West's Fault." Students at the University of Chicago wrote the president of the university denouncing Mearsheimer over what they dubbed, quote, Putinism. They called it propaganda and anti-Ukrainian ideology.
Yeah, and they also asked, I'm looking at this letter, so they asked the university to get Mearsheimer to make a statement of his current position regarding Russian aggression in Ukraine, whatever it may be. And then they want a statement from the university community at large that it does not condone anti-Ukrainian ideology on campus.
So first of all, what is anti-Ukrainian ideology? That's not an ideology.
Right.
It's not a thing. But let's go through so their letter quotes three things that they pulled out of his YouTube video, which I bet 90% of the people watching this have seen portions of, or something. It has something like 15, 16 million views at this point. It's one of those things that YouTube just keeps showing to people. I watched it. It's a compelling conversation. Yes.
How interesting.
So
into our grievances at the moment.
Exactly. Yes. The platform that shall not be named.
The platform that shall not be named.
Or that we shall not be named upon.
Right.
For our sins. So these are the three claims. Let's go one by one. Quote, "A significant element of the participants in the Ukrainian Revolution of Dignity were fascists," unquote. So that the students are quoting Mearsheimer saying that. Depends on what you mean by significant. A non-trivial? Like, what do you want? Like some significant number. Like if some of your more prominent leaders, and also, we're talking the people in the Maidans where, this isn't thousands. So if dozens or scores or hundreds are affiliated with neo-Nazis or what became the Azov battalion, then I'm sorry, that doesn't mean that the entire revolution is necessarily therefore tainted as a Nazi revolution, but he's saying a significant element of the participants, okay. And if they want to argue with him, I'm for that. Like in fact, for my podcast Deconstructed, I interviewed a guy, Vladimir Ishchenko, Ukrainian leftist, who's studying this like empirically and deeply with all kinds of research. They could talk to him, ask him what he thinks about the presence of neo-Nazis in the Maidan. So who would you score this one for, students or Mearsheimer?
No, Mearsheimer's right.
All right, so second one, quote, "The revolution was a coup," unquote. I mean, the president was ousted.
Yeah.
Not an election.
No, it was a coup. If
you support him, you call it a coup. If you oppose him, you call it a revolution.
Right.
Okay.
That's a very U.S. thing to do.
Right. Yes. Quote, "The war in the Donbas region was largely a civil war," unquote. They pulled this slightly out of context because he also says that Russia is driving. Like Russia is, funding and training a lot of the people in the Donbas region who are the kind of Russian-backed separatists. But he says the war in the Donbas region was largely a civil war, and he's contrasting it with A, Crimea, which was just annexed by Russia, and B, the idea of a full-on invasion, which is what this is. What he's doing now this is not a civil war. This is an invasion of Ukraine by Russia. So, is it a civil war? One group of Ukrainians who are Russian-aligned fighting another group of Ukrainians who are Western-aligned? That sounds like a civil war to me.
And we have essentially said on this show something along the lines of, this is it's not the invasion is Putin's fault, but the U.S. NATO's policy for a long time was bad and helped get us into this situation. That's just I agree with that.
Yeah, and it's also
both said that.
It's also possible that if the U.S. had never had dissolved NATO after the Soviet Union. Let's say they dissolved NATO after the Soviet Union collapses because they say the purpose of NATO was to guard against the Soviet Union. Soviet Union's gone. NATO is gone. Long live European solidarity. It's still possible Putin might have invaded.
Yeah.
That's not the world we live in. The world we live in is the one in which they expanded NATO.
All of our choices got us to this.
Got us to this got us to this point. We don't know if those choices led to it, but we do know that this is not the outcome that anybody wanted. And going through the details is almost besides the point.
Right.
If the students have a problem with the professor,
right,
email the professor. He seems like he's giving interviews to anybody who asks.
And this is just, a handful of students, so I'll refrain from calling it the most egregious attempted cancellation ever. But small groups of irate students do get people canceled all the time. So don't do that.
Right. And I'm still hung up on the idea of anti-Ukrainian ideology, because his whole argument was that what the West is doing is going to get Ukraine destroyed for a mistake. So A, he didn't agree with the idea, but B, he said that Ukraine is
for
going
a policy
to
we're not going to do anyway, admit them to NATO.
And that's another point that he always made, that you're not going to actually defend Ukraine militarily. So if you're not going to defend Ukraine militarily,
don't put them in the situation where they would need to be defended militarily, when we won't.
Right, and to call that anti-Ukrainian is also, what is anti-Ukrainian ideology? Come on, guys.
Right, it's looking for it's trying to make it like a racism kind of thing, right? That's
it
what
is.
The
it's trying to slot it. It's trying to slot it into that.
To ideology or racism or
right
or anti-Islamic or something, that kind of thing.
And I get seeing images of a sovereign country, innocent civilians, who one day are living normal lives.
Oh, it's horrific.
Doing nothing wrong, and then the next day living in a bombed-out hellscape. Like, I get it, that the impulse is to want to do something. Mearsheimer is at your school. This is something that you can do. But it's just not very well thought through.
Right. Speaking of not very well thought through things to do, over the weekend we also learned that acclaimed Russian opera singer Anna Nabretko was cast aside from performing at the Metropolitan Opera after she refused to speak out against Putin. And there's this kind of rapidly escalating, we're not just doing sanctions, we're doing like moral boycotts of all Russians, all Russian people, Russian products that are associated with Russia that aren't even Russian, like the vodka. That seems it's very like freedom fries reminiscent. Yeah, we've talked about this before, and also it's very xenophobic in some way. Like, the people of Russia are victims of the Putin regime as well. Many of them are against this war. Many more of them would speak out against it if they didn't have to fear for their lives, or if they knew the full story. They're subjected to relentless propaganda. So I don't see what purpose that really serves to go to that level. It's actually something that Democrats, that liberals have resisted doing in a number of other situations. How not all Muslim people are our enemies during 9/11 and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. But this time it's gone a little further in the no, Russians are our enemies. Right. Even though nobody's saying that, but then they're acting like that. Right. When they do this kind of thing.
I guess we were primed for it by all the Cold War rhetoric that we lived through for 50 years. But the Russian people, I think, just like Gorbachev, expected that the West would treat the collapse of the Soviet Union with magnanimity and with a Marshall Plan to revive and turn it into a prosperous kind of European Western democracy that was then integrated into the country. That was the belief of people like Gorbachev, and I think millions of Russians. It quickly became clear that the West was going to pick the carcass of the Soviet Union and put in charge these oligarchs. So the national steel industry would be given to one oligarch. The gas company would be given to another oligarch, oil company to another oligarch. Every major industry was auctioned off at this tiny little auction run by Harvard people to the people who then became the oligarchs. And in order to enforce that, you need a strongman like a Putin to crack down and make sure that there's no actual democracy. And so then to say that that's the fault of the Russian people is just completely unfair on so many different levels.
Absolutely. Well, Tesla billionaire Elon Musk pushed U.S. oil and gas output as the West considers energy sanctions over Russia's invasion of Ukraine. We'll be discussing that with our rising panel, so stick around.